Well, let me share with you a memory to begin with. So, I'm looking back. This is 15 years ago now. Imagine, there was a music festival, a water music festival, in August of 2009. And there was a lot of music. There was flute tunes and German songs. There was an orchestra from Slovakia and enough jazz to make all the dead clergy spin in their graves. This was in Carrick-on-Shannon, Leitrim, where they once had marches to ban jazz music. There was a band in blue suits, and they played music by Big Joe Turner and Bill Haley. There were saxophones, cellos, and an opera by Handel, a band on a boat in the river, and a long-haired violinist flashing his beautiful eyes in the Bush Hotel. When I hear jazz in Leitrim, I think of Hitler and Father Confrey, or Conifrey. The former, Hitler, banished jazz from Paris, and the latter, Father Conifrey, tried to get De Valera to ban jazz in Leitrim. But I wasn't there for the jazz. Remember, this is 15 years ago. I just wanted to meet Charlie McGettigan. In fact, there was a time I actually wanted to be Charlie McGettigan. So on Thursday evening of this particular August festival in 2009, I decided to go to the variety performance and tell him the story. In 1973, I used to have a cortina, and I often squeezed 5 girls into it, and we'd float down the slopes of Quilca Mountain to the towns along the Shannon, bound for dance halls, where we could jive and sweat. Sweating was a faint form of arousal for a sexually repressed generation. Sometimes we'd go to sing in pubs and get plastered, and it wasn't easy keeping the cortina between the ditches on the way home. At that time, Charlie McGettigan used to gig in the Silver Swan in Carrick-on-Shannon. All the girls in my cortina adored him, and that's why I wanted to be Charlie McGettigan. But then, years later, in 2009, on a Thursday evening, Charlie sat in the dressing room of the Dock, tuning his guitar. A crowd of other performers milled around. He was nervous. It didn't seem like the time to tell him anything important, or that when I was 20, I dreamed of being him. Charlie's hair is grey now, and his face is etched with life's ups and downs. When he walked into the glaring spotlights, he seemed shy, and his eyes focused on the audience. "I recognize a lot of people here," he whispered. The audience murmured with affection. "Anyone remember this?" he inquired, as he plucked the chords and softly let the words out. "How many roads must a man walk down before they call him a man? How many seas must the white dove sail before she sleeps in the sand?" He delivered every song as if he was talking to someone he loved. in an easy one-to-one intimacy. It didn't feel like a performance, it felt like real life. And then all of a sudden he got funny. He remarked on the vast amount of bathrooms there must be in all the big mansions built in Leitrim over the past 15 years. This, by the way, remember, was 2009. In our day, he said, the only ensuite was a chamber pot. And we must have stunk to high heaven because we were only allowed into the bath when someone else got out. There would be scum on the surface of the water if you lay still for more than 2 minutes, says he. This led him into an old song about a mousetrap hidden in a chamber pot beneath a bed. The last verse left the audience in stitches of laughter. And then he introduced one of his own famous songs with the modesty of a countryman. Maura O'Connell was in my house one night, he said, and she found this song in an old notebook. As if all life was an accident. His fingers plucked the strings and he began, I hope you find the feet of a dancer. I hope you can sing in the rain. When the concert was over, I drove around town. The floodlit car parks near Tesco's looked like some bland nowhere in America. But along the waterfront, the moon shone down on the Shannon, and I could understand why my father and mother came here in 1951 for the first night of their honeymoon. I parked the jeep and was walking towards the Landmark Hotel to hear the swinging Blue Cats when I saw Charlie again. He was putting his guitar into the boot of his car. We talked for ages about Bob Dylan and Cinema Paradiso and the days when it cost 3 pennies to travel by train from Ballyshannon to the beach at Rosnowla. We were looking back, as rock and roll kids do. Both of us were too long in the tooth by 2009 to be bothered with who or what we once dreamed of being. That was once upon a time, before we knew what life had in store. There was no point in mentioning the girls in the old Cortina. I suppose they're all soaking merrily in the bathrooms and jacuzzis of modern Leitrim. But I'd lay a bet that they still love Charlie McGettigan. And when I was reflecting on Charlie, when I was writing that in 2009, it was just before the crash. Well, just on the lip of the crash. So everything was still good, and in some sense, I thought we were old looking back. And now, how many years later? 10, 14 years later? 14, nearly 15 years later, I'm now looking back on the time that I was looking back. Now that surely makes me old. I was only in my late 50s when I wrote that. And now I'm 70. And I was thinking about that particular memory this week because I've also been writing a lot about John Moriarty. And John Moriarty, well, he's a philosopher. He passed away, I think, in 2008 from Kerry. He's just somebody that needs to be read, needs to be understood. He was a wise and profound person. And I think he was a very holy man. There's another great man called Martin Shaw, and he's a storyteller, and he'll be going around Ireland in the next month. And in fact, I have dates. He's in Kilkenny in Clears pub on the 11th of October. He's in the Fumbally Stables in Dublin on the 13th of October. He's in Thor Ballylee in Galway on the 14th. On Grianon in Donegal, Letterkenny on the 19th. The Hawkswell in Sligo on the 21st of October. I'm going to be there on that night to listen to him. And then on the 25th, he's in the Bell Table. On the 26th, he's in the Micklally Theatre in Galway. 28th, he's in the Attic in Hotel Doolin, sorry. And on the 29th, he's in Cathy Barry's Bar in Waterford. I mentioned Martin Shaw. He's a storyteller, and I can't explain much to you about him except I think he's the bee's knees, and I think that you'd find him, Dr. Martin Shaw, you'd find him on YouTube if you ever have a fancy to listen to someone talking about story. The way he says it is this, that there are mythic stories, great stories of myth, and they're not in our heads. It's more that we are in the story. It's like as if storytelling was something that had its own energy outside our psyche. And it sort of is like viral. It comes into our psyche and we tell the story. We pass the story on. And when you think like that, you begin to think in terms of religious stories, and then eventually you begin to think about God, about how the logos, the stories and the telling of stories, carry some ultimate truth. So that's Martin Shaw, and he connects with John Moriarty, and I suppose in some sense he's like Moriarty. I think he's even editing a book about Moriarty, or maybe editing a book of Moriarty's work. So John Moriarty, if you don't know who he is, again, go to YouTube and Google him, search on YouTube, and you'll find some of his stuff there. Big head of hair, a big eccentric Kerryman, a philosopher, very erudite, lovely man. I met him once in Clifton, in the foyer of a hotel. I think he was coming in, I was going out. We were both at the festival. And I knew him from his work and he knew me from my work, and so we stopped and said hello and we shook hands and promised to meet later, and we never did. And we corresponded once or twice. He wrote to me when he was ill, near the end of his life. He sent me his last book, and I wrote about him in the newspaper. I sang his praises and I sent him a letter. So there was a little exchange between us, but nothing much. And then afterwards, about a year after he died, I did a kind of a lament for him in Shiamsa. So Shiamsa Chira, the folk theatre down there in Kerry, we all got together and we made a show, put it on for about 10 nights, as a lament for the great Kerry philosopher. And I'll read you something now which is kind of my tribute to him. I'll give you the title of it now. I called it, let me see where it is if I can find it. I called it In Remembrance of the Elder That Walked in the Dream Time. And this is, if you like, a song of remembrance and praise to John Moriarty. I'm a storyteller, a person who lives for the relish of remembering. I suppose most people feel that in the end we're all alone, without certainty, except for the impending annihilation that will come with the grave. And so remembrance is an act of defiance. To tell a story of love or to remember friends is a form of standing in eternity. In remembering others that have loved, I still suspect that we belong to each other in ways I don't understand. It's like saying that when people come to me in dreams, then they have really come to me. And why do I remember some people in particular? Why do certain people return again and again to remind me of their existence? For example, I'm never done talking about an old bachelor I knew 50 years ago when I lived on the slopes of Quilca Mountain in West Cavan. He lived in the hills alone in a 2-story house with his tin whistle, his conjuring tricks, his deck of cards and his mysterious picture of a lady with a German shepherd dog. The eyes of both the lady and the dog followed the observer round the room. Magician and entertainer, jam-jar, bottom spectacles, brown hair in a wave that Elvis Presley would have been proud of. Phil Bernard was the star of the show. His house was full of derelict rooms, and the local children said, perhaps unfairly, that his hair was full of boot polish. A musty kitchen, the smell of turf, a dirty frying pan, and a strip of yellow flypaper hanging from the ceiling. And in the middle of it all, Dapper, in a 3-piece brown herring bone suit. The suit may have been a bit shiny in spots, but there was no doubt that Phil Bernard was a performer and a professional. He played tin whistle as if it were a saxophone, and jigs and reels if you wanted them, though he was happiest with big band numbers. He often dispensed with the whistle, preferring to sing out the chorus with the physicality of the lead in a Broadway musical. Enjoy yourself, it's later than you think. Phil Bernard was a jazzman. He often stood at the back door in a storm where he kept his stack of empty porter bottles, and he'd look out on the ash saplings clinging to the ditches, and the rushes clinging to the hill, and his face would darken. And he'd say to me, "Jeepers, Michael, aren't we living in an awful goddamn part of the world, to be sure?" He used to whisper Carnegie Hall like a mantra, bringing it into existence by saying it. His dream would have been an open stage, the instrument resting by his side, the audience on their feet, and he, the performer, the star, taking a deep and humble bow. He dreamed of being appreciated. But instead of Carnegie Hall, he just got public houses, parish hall concerts, and wedding receptions. Although every song he sang as if he was truly on the stage in Carnegie Hall. And the children who said he had boot polish in his hair invited him to all their weddings, and they loved him without measure. I saw him some years before he died. The kitchen was darker. He sat on the seat of an old Morris Minor, staring at the wall. He was white-haired and blind. We talked about telephones. By then, the neighbours' children, and the children of their children, were in Queens and Brooklyn. They called on him on his newly installed telephone one night when Sinead O'Connor was playing in New York, and they promised to send him the tapes. He died in a nursing home in County Fermanagh, and someone placed his old tin whistle on the coffin, put it in with him so that he could play tunes in heaven. And perhaps because his dapper suits and skills as an entertainer astonished me, or maybe because he could lift the hearts of people around him when he walked into someone's kitchen, no matter what shadows were on them. He was a scatterer of shadows. He was a comic, a rural comedian, a bard and teller of stories, and his stories were always full of light. Another person who haunted me for years after she passed away was a woman I met in a creative writing workshop in early 1990s. Brown hair falling down either side of her face, eyes bulging with enthusiasm behind round-rimmed spectacles, all wrapped up in a duffel coat. At the time, she was in recovery from cancer. She still retained an aura of a Trinity College undergraduate somewhere out of the late 60s. She had an enthusiasm for writing and flowers and dogs. In fact, she had enthusiasm for everything. She couldn't control her joy. A poem by Yeats, a field of daisies, everything was thoroughly wonderful. And then illness struck again, and this time she knew she had no chance. I remember her looking out at the lake as the evening sun hung like an orange lantern above the water. "Gosh," she said with joy, "just look at that sky. Isn't it beautiful?" And I looked, and I beheld the miracle of sunset and of her limitless astonishment as she relished every moment of her life. At the end, she threw a party for her friends to sing and dance and celebrate. Old enemies were invited to say farewell, to forgive and be forgiven. By all accounts, it was a wonderful party. She always had that well-bred elegance that makes men daft with notions of women as swans. And on that particular day, her 60th birthday, she was radiant, beautiful and happy. And she wore a pink sari. The funeral was held in a derelict church beside the lake. A few dozen friends around the coffin. And when the prayers had all been said, someone stood and began singing Amazing Grace. Gradually, the bedraggled Leitrim Bohemia joined in, until we were all one in song, one breath, and one swoon of grief. We laid her down on the wind-swept hill above the church, where she rests under beech trees. Before she died, I asked her why the pink sari. Two enormous eyes, bubbling with joy, looked up at me from the pillow with her usual intense excitement. "Oh," she said, "because pink is my favourite colour." When I pass the place where she once lived, I never think of her grave, or the carpet of fallen leaves around it. But sometimes at the water's edge, I think I see her smiling in a sari, waiting for someone else. And maybe it's unusual that I should also remember John Moriarty, because I didn't know him well, apart from reading his extraordinary books. We exchanged letters near the end of his life, but I only met him once in the foyer of a hotel in Clifton. We knew each other from things we had published, and we shook hands and expressed an intention to meet later, but it never happened. Instead, I read his books and listened to his voice, until for a while his ghost became the closest friend of my soul. Then, years after he died, one night and restless, I woke to find him at the end of the bed. I did not need to ask for his name. His hair was unruly like waves of the ocean, his eyes as tender as the gaze of an old whale, and the voice in him reverberated around the bedroom. He invited me to leave the bed and join him in his dream time. So we walked together, a long way, hand in hand, and him taller than me, so that he towered over me like a giant, perhaps because I had found my child's body and the child's eye with which to look up at him. After a long time walking, we saw a cottage in the distance. It was only a speck of yellow light in the far-away forest, but as we walked, it came closer, closer and closer, until I could make out a window of amber light and flickering shadows within. The door opened by itself, the light spilling out like a carpet before us. "Come in," he said, standing on the threshold. I knew I was dreaming, and I knew that the real world had drifted far away, and that this cottage was in the deepest layer of the forest. But I stepped inside and felt the heat. "Now," says Moriarty, "sit down there on that stool at the fire." And so I did. He asked me a question. "Do you know who you are at all?" But I was tongue-tied, the way one gets in dreams. And in the silence I saw a frown darken his face, and then his entire expression turned to stone. The struggle now to speak, as if the muscles were frozen, became enormous. "The Lord save us," he said, horrified. "Do you not know who you are?" But I couldn't answer. The silence was like a frost that came over us, and his expression withered into stone, and the stone deepened in his skull so that he couldn't think either, and the warm yellow kitchen withered into stone, and his body, like an old statue, crumbled like dust. And when I looked at the fire grate, I saw that there was no flame in it, and in its stead only the remnants of long-ago ashes and a crumbling back wall and a rusty kettle hanging on a black hook. The house was devastated, and that was the end of the dream. But I was not awake. I had only woken from one dream into another. It was early morning, and I was running away from the cottage. On the slope of a hill I saw him alive again, crouching to the ground with his ear tucked into a hollow in the grass where a hare had been sleeping. In the distance there were more hares, moving like shadows in the early dawn. There were birds in the trees and fish in a mountain stream beside me, and daylight like water was swallowing their shadows. A hare approached me. "What's wrong with you?" she wanted to know, but I still couldn't speak. It was the kind of dream where you know you're in a dream, and you can't speak, but you know what you want to say. I wanted to say that Moriarty had died years ago, but that in the end everyone dies. He had cancer, and when he was getting chemotherapy, his hair fell out, and he threw some of it into the garden one day. And the next day he noticed a little bird had taken the hair and was using it to build a nest. "I know," said the hare, reading my mind. "I've heard that story. I suppose he was at home in the wilderness." In fact, I've seen him oftentimes looking into the stream and talking to the water. The hare moved off, but I could still see Moriarty on the ground, listening at the hollow in the bog where the hare had slept. I wanted to say his name, to call out to him, and I tried, but it stuck in my throat, and the silence woke me. And I woke into yet another dream. It was as if I was waking and Moriarty was in the bed beside me, and I could see his face floating in the darkness, up close to my own. This was a dream time of enclosed space, a small room, his face like a gigantic icon floating in the dark, his head upon the pillow. "Any minute now," he whispered, "the latch will be lifted. Any minute now there will be a knock on the door. An angel will tell me my time is up, my race is run." I understood that he was stretched on his deathbed. No more music in the trumpet for me, no more music in the pipe, no more music in the fiddle for me, no more music in the drum. And then he turned sideways on the pillow and spoke to me. "Will I tell you a story?" says he. "Yes, please," I replied. "I was digging the peat one day," he began, "on the bog, digging in the deepest spit between the tree stumps, when I discovered a pair of magical boots, ancient boots made from the skin of a deer. A pair of boots 5,000 years old. So going up onto the bank, I put off my own boots, and I put on these 5,000-year-old boots, crisscrossing the lace, a tracery about my shins and collops, knotting them under my knees, boots that were 5,000 years old. And to test them and get the feel of them, I got up and started walking, going the wind's way. I walked on anyway, and that's how I found peace and happiness. I found the path by walking in boots that were made 5,000 years ago, and nobody fenced me in." He closed his eyes and smiled, and I wondered, "Where are you now, John?" "I'm crossing the yard," he whispered, "and I can see my father's old horse tackle on the wall of the shed, and the instruments for farming long ago, and I am filling sacks from the big wall of clamped turf and carrying it across the yard to the house, where the fire burns beautifully and sparks dance up the chimney." After a while he spoke again. "How strange it is," he said, "to be crossing the yard at nightfall, with a prehistoric landscape on my back, and for the rest of the night I would sit by the fire and dream in my chair. It suited me. I was good at it. It came naturally to me on a winter's night to sink to the sod's level. It came naturally to me sitting there to sink into the deepest pit of dreams." "Am I dreaming?" I wondered. "It's a good question," he said, "but maybe we are all dreaming. I worked all day with only a spade and shovel, with only a digging fork and bow saw and secateurs and long-handled cutters and pick and crowbar and sledgehammer and axe and hoe and rake, and then I rested. But now it's late, and maybe you are dreaming, and I am dreaming inside you, and outside the hawthorn bush is dreaming, and the turf is dreaming, and the spider on the turf creel is dreaming, and the birds up on the mountain are dreaming. It's dark in here, I said. Don't worry, says he. Christ is a light in the darkness, and the darkness is nothing to be afraid of. In fact, I'm always very easy with the darkness. I didn't bother lighting the lamp. Even on winter nights I didn't light it. Without the lamp the house was full of shadows, and there was more understanding in firelight and shadows for the kind of man I am. Always bring water from the well and turf from the shed before it gets dark. Prepare yourself for the journey. Those were the two last jobs I always did in the evenings, before the darkness closed in, before the stories rose up out of the silence and lit up the night like lanterns. Will I tell you another story? Please do, I said. I remember one night a cobbler offered to mend my shoe. He wanted to get his hammer and lashed and put a sole on my shoe as he usually did. But my mother said no, because the hen was sitting on eggs in a wooden butter box under the small table, waiting to hatch the little specks of life. My mother feared that the noise of the hammer and the lash might disturb the clocking hen. That's a law I learned, and I have lived by it all my life. It's one of my 10 commandments. Never make murderous sounds in the quiet world. And there was silence, and I realized that I was in the pit of a bog hole, and he was stretched on the clay beside me, as deep down as a cloth of butter that might be hidden for 5,000 years. While up at ground level, far away across the bog, there was someone playing a tin whistle. I could hear the music above us. And then I saw John's eyes open, and I saw him put on boots. What are you doing, I wondered. And up at ground level, at the lip of the bog hole, I could see a woman in a pink sari. And I could hear the music of a tin whistle, and I could see Moriarty smiling at them as he climbed into the sky, up the boggy bank, and went away with them to dance Cornishiog around the mountain. He didn't look back, and in his wake was a bog-deep silence all about me. And that silence woke me. Or maybe I woke into yet another dream, a dream time that for years I had mistaken for reality. As they say in Tibet, treat all phenomena as like illusions. As Moriarty used to say, walk beautifully on the earth in your own dream time. Should I try, John? I try. The Lord save us. Oh, and that's me little homage to John Moriarty. And I was telling you a story about remembering Charlie McGettigan. And the story happened in 2008 or 2009. I'm remembering McGettigan. And then I'm actually remembering the remembrance. When I'm reading it to you, it's 14 years later. And that's where stories start. If you look at your life, you will find that there's ordinary things you remember. You can go back 10 years, you can go back 20, maybe more, and you remember things. And sometimes conversation is never more beautiful than when you're remembering people around the table. Like, for example, I always feel you ruin the party when you talk politics. You ruin the party when you talk religion. Religion should be practiced, but really maybe never spoken about. In some sense, me sharing this with you is a deep intimacy. It's a deep privacy. It's like I wouldn't like to do it publicly. Because ideas can divide people, and no more than in politics. It's a huge way that people get divided. And you ruin a party. You know, you might buy a lovely chicken and it'll come out of the best, Dunn stores or wherever, and a corn-fed chicken, and you'd roast it and you'd have good wine, and all the guests are around the table, and then somebody says something like, what do you think of Brexit, or what do you think of Trump, or what do you think of Putin? And immediately you have ruined the evening, because there's for and against, and people are now suddenly divided. Well, if you want to make people happy at the dinner table, and I've said this before, just tell them a story. Share something from your own life, some memory. People love to belong in your story. As you're talking about your memory, they'll be feeling they're part of it. And it'll be triggering memories for them. That's what happens. I tell the story about, say, meeting Charlie McGettigan, and he was doing his concert, and he told a few stories on stage, and then I'm remembering him when I was young and had a concertina, or a cortina, and these young women who used to all be fans of Charlie McGettigan. It's all memory. It's all just simple story. Now, that's okay. The same is true then when I'm sharing it with you, and it's now 2023, and we're looking back on that moment, it's like the crash happened very soon after that. So this idea of memory goes on and on and on. Where it gets really interesting, where story gets really interesting, is when it becomes a mythic story. And you can notice that when I started talking about, for example, Phil Bernard, the man who used to be singing songs up in Glengavlin, like Enjoy Yourself, it's later than you think, or when I talked about my dear friend in the pink sari who passed away, but she was so full of joy, even when she was very ill. So I'm talking about those people, I'm sharing those memories with you, the real memories, they're from the ordinary world of reality. But when I started remembering John Moriarty, I shifted into a kind of a memory that was like remembering a dream. And then within the dream, it's like Moriarty is talking to me, but it's not real anymore, is it? It's like there's sort of magical things happening in the story. Like he's turning to stone because I don't know who I am. He asks me, who are you? And I can't tell him. And then he turns to stone, and the lovely warm house he was in begins to wither. So that's not realism. That's like some sort of mythic story I'm telling. And yet, and I know that it's like something true is in it. There's something, I'm saying something really true about Moriarty and about me. And I can't name it, like rationalise it or explain it. I can only tell it to you in a myth. And maybe that's why we have dreams, because what's communicated in the dream cannot be communicated in any other way. And yet it's important. And then I tell the remembrance of Moriarty, and he's sort of listening there's a big hole, in a dinge in the heather where the hare was sleeping, and he has his ear down into that and he's listening. And that's like a real thing that happened to Moriarty, but I've now transformed it. It's part of my dream. And so it's like Moriarty has now come to me as a mentor, as a wise elder in my dream, and is speaking to me, and then he starts telling me stories. Now he's telling me stories. He's telling me about boots he got, 5,000-year-old boots. Like, every so often in the bogs you find something like butter that's 5,000 years old. Well, apparently Moriarty on one occasion found boots, 5,000-year-old, and he put them on. And then he says, that's how I found happiness. I walked in these boots. Now, obviously, he wore modern shoes like the rest of us, but we've moved into the mythological realm. You might say the imaginal realm. The imaginal realm is the realm not of fantasy, but the realm where imagined things are more real or more true than what they are like on the surface. So I'm now talking about the Moriarty who exists within me, the kind of voice of the elder who comes to me from the back of the cave and gives me wisdom in dreams. And that's where storytelling eventually ends up. So you start with memories, your own simple memories of maybe a bicycle you had and what it looked like and where you used to cycle it when you were young. It's a memory. And you share it at the dinner table, and it gathers people in, and people belong to the story. And then people share their stories. But gradually in storytelling, you begin to tell stories that are like dreams. And they're true, and you know they're true, even though they're not literally true. And now you're just a step away from the whole idea of God's presence. Because in the beginning was the Word. This idea in Christianity that the Logos, Christ is the Word, the spokenness of God. And in this spokenness, you can read it like a dream. It's a very beautiful way to read the Gospels, like dreams. But not like dreams that are untrue. Read them like dreams that are true, like in the imaginal realm. When Jesus is feeding the loaves and the fishes to the people around him, he's doing it in the dream time. He's still doing it. He's doing it now in this moment in your brain, in your heart. When Jesus is on the cross, he's now on the cross, in this moment, in the dream time. When Jesus walks in the garden, the resurrected Christ, the cosmic Christ, the light of the world, so brightly shining that Mary, come to anoint the body, does not recognize him until he speaks her name, and he looks at her and he says, Mary. And she says, Adonai, my Lord. She recognizes. You begin to read the story now like in the dream time, like it's happening now. And this dream time is the imaginal realm because it is happening now. It's happening now because the story is being told, because the reality is not us and us having this big attic in our heads where we keep all the stories. The stories stuck in our brains as if we controlled the stories. That's not the case. What I'm proposing to you is that the stories hold us. The stories throw us up as the tellers, as the speakers. But in fact, what lasts longer than us is the story. The story continues eternally. The story is there. The revelation of God is there eternally. Moriarty is forever in my dream, at the back of the cave, speaking to me. Jesus is forever walking on the water of Galilee as Peter looks out of the boat and wonders, will I go to him? Will I go to you, Lord? And the Lord Christ says, yeah, come to me. Come to me, all of you. That's in the dream of now. That's happening now. And that's the way that the Gospels are the most wonderful, amazing Sufi stories, really. This is Sufi storytelling. This is the wisdom that comes through stories, which is actually the ground of all reality. It is us who are the illusions. The story is eternal. The death and resurrection of Christ is eternal. Moriarty, the old wise man whispering to you in your dream, is eternal. Your living out of it on the surface of reality is just a passing moment. And if your life and my life is a passing moment, then there's nothing to be worried about, nothing to be scared about, nothing to be anxious about, nothing to be wired up about. Everything here on the surface is impermanent. Everything on the surface is changing and will pass. Only what is remembered, only in story, is the fullness of meaning made complete. That little story about Moriarty is just between you and me. So thank you for being here.